Hello, everybody. Hello, welcome. Happy Thursday. It is good to see you all. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. This is the My Jewish Learning weekly Daf Yomi week in review, where we spend half an hour looking at some highlights from what happened this week in Daf Yomi. This is going to be our last review in the Babas because Wednesday we will read the last page of Baba Batra, which is the last tractate of the triplicate of the trio. So quite a landmark. I will share in the comments in a few minutes once I've finished admitting everybody information about our Siyum. It's also in your daily emails. But now I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Rabbi Ari Sachs for today's review.
Sounds wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Thank you to Rachel and My Jewish Learning for inviting me back for another session together. It is such a joy to be learning with you, especially as we come to the end of Bava Batra. And I'm curious, especially since we're coming to the end, if you want to put into the comments something interesting that you learned from all of the wonderful, stimulating conversation on debts and signatures and all of the minutia that comes with how to make a society work, because I think that that's one of the most fascinating things about studying Talmud. It's There was one particular passage in here that reminded me of a comment made to me by a friend who's a lawyer, who said that bad law is created by difficult cases, and that when you have a difficult case and you make law around that, it's very difficult to actually use that law for any other circumstance, because the issue with difficult cases is that it's difficult. It's really hard to manage. And I think what's so fascinating about Talmud overall is just how it focuses so much on, well, what about this? What is this issue? And though they're trying to kind of figure out what is the law, like but mahu halacha, I think in many ways it's really just about dealing with those very difficult cases. And that's what makes it just so fascinating and can be sometimes head scratching trying to follow the logic with everything. So, in many ways, this is also about how we are transmitting our tradition from one generation to the next, which is a part of what I wanted to share, or I wanted to focus on for today. Because one of the pieces from our learning for this past week in Daf Yomi that I found to be particularly fascinating is the relationships of some of the main characters, in particularly the family relationships of the Gamliel family. And so for that, I want to share my screen, and I want you to see on my screen. One second, I'm just going to get up here. Here, you will see an example, or I should say, not an example. This is a family tree. That's very important. And it's not like that big of a family tree, but you'll see why I only had this up for now. Just as a little bit of a background, I am a third generation conservative rabbi, and I was speaking to a reporter from the Jewish Exponent here in Philadelphia about like what I'm doing for my work and as a rabbi. And one of the main things he got out of it is that I come from a generation of rabbis. And I think that sometimes the family relationships that we have and sort of the professions that we kind of go into, especially when we have other family members who are part of it, in many ways, we are part of that legacy, and it's that legacy that kind of really jumps off the page. So if I'm trying to write an article about someone, like, oh yeah, there's this person who is a multi-generational person, multi-generational rabbinic family, and that's what's so fascinating. And in many ways, the Talmud, and especially our section today, kind of reflects that. So here you have a little bit of a family tree, just 3 generations, starting from Nasira ban Gamliel of Yavne, who is a Tana of the 3rd generation. And he has 2 different children, or particularly 2 different children, although actually, as you're about to find out, he had many more. And one of them we really know, which is another Nasi, Probably different spelling. Nasi Rabban Shimon Gamliel. Now, by the way, it is a little bit difficult to tell who is Shimon ben Gamliel or Shimon Gamliel or just Gamliel because there's actually two different versions of them. Meaning like Nasi Rabban Gamliel of Yavne was not the first Rabban Gamliel. Nasi Rabban Shimon Gamliel was not the first of them. They're actually the second of them. But I want you to notice that under Nasi Rabban Shimon Gamliel, you have Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the one who edited the entire Talmud. Now, what's fascinating, especially about if you take a look at this, is that you have the fifth generation Tana and a fourth generation and third, fourth, fifth generation Tanaim. In general, arguments that happen in Talmud have to be within the context of a specific generation. You sometimes have different generation of Tanaim who have arguments, but you can never have, let's say, an Amora, who is a rabbi for the Gemara, have an argument with a Tana. The Amora is trying to actually explain what the Tana is supposed to say. But even when it comes to the Tanaim, you're really not supposed to have an argument across generations because you want to have that respect for previous generations. So, for instance, as a third generation rabbi, I have to be very mindful of the fact that my father, my grandfather were rabbis, and that I need to show respect and deference in certain ways to their legacy because I'm a part of that legacy. And with that in mind, I want you to, so you're just going to keep this for here right now, just to see this family tree. And I want you to notice we have Hanina ben Gamliel, who is Nasi Rabban Shimon Gamliel's brother, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's uncle. Okay, so keep that in mind. And when it come to back to the text that we have for today, and notice that at the very beginning, or towards the beginning of our learning, we have the following. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Hanina ben Gamliel says, a tied document whose witnesses wrote their signatures inside of it is valid because one can transform it into an ordinary document by untying it. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi raised an objection to the statement of Rabbi Hanina ben Gamliel, but the date of this one, a tied document, is not the same as the date of that one, an ordinary document. Now, one just quick thought point about this. It really has to do, or let me put it this way. One of the main things about this section is how do we know that a document is valid? And until I read this, I did not necessarily know so much the value of I'm blanking on the word, but when you go especially to a lawyer and they're able to put a stamp and to a notary public, that's the word I'm looking for. If there were notary publics in the Talmud, we would have no need for like 5 pages of this section of Bava Batra, because what it's talking about is how can you know that this document is real and it's not fake, is not forged, is not a mistake in some way. And so they're going through a lot of that conversation. They're going through a lot of those issues. And in particular, there's this idea that if you have a tie document, almost imagining like you see on like medieval shows that you have a scroll and it's tied and it's got the stamp of the king or so, and it's being then brought to who's over going to get it. And if you open it, but first you need to know, is this an official document? Oh, if it has the seal, then it's good. Okay, what if it doesn't have the seal? You open it up, and then inside you had the stamp of the king. Well, if it's a very important document, shouldn't have also have had the seal. That's kind of what they're talking about. And so what the argument is between Hanina ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is if you don't have the kind of the seal with the signature on the outside of the document, is that if you don't have it, is the document still valid? Because if you open it up, it's there, but it doesn't actually have the same kind of validity, given the fact that an official document needs to have that seal with the signature, and an ordinary document does not. So that seems to be the argument, is whether or not this seemingly important document can still be important, even though the only way to check that it's actually true is by making an ordinary document when you open it up. The larger point, I think, here is that you have this machloket, you have this debate between Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and Rabbi Hanina ben Gamliel. But remember, if you go back now to the chart, remember that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is Hanina ben Gamliel's nephew. And so you have a machloket between a nephew and you have machloket between a nephew and an uncle. And I want you to think about your own family dynamics. Is that a kind of argument that you would be okay with in your family? And maybe it is, because, we'd like to argue, we like to have disagreements. But then I want you to think about this particular section, which follows the argument between Hanina ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Okay, so if you're following in the document that was the link that was shared, we go down to the next source, which is 164b, 13 to 16. That the Gemara relates there was a certain Thai document that came before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, not realizing it was a folded document, said, "There is no date on this document, so it is not valid." Rabbi Shimon, son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, said to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, "Perhaps the date is hidden between its folds." Okay? So all that the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is doing is asking his dad, "Hey, Dad, maybe you just missed the signature. Maybe it's just somewhere in there." Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi opened it and saw that the date was in fact between the tied folds. Afterwards, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi looked at his son disapprovingly, as he held that one should not write a tied document. Now, the question here that I'm wondering is, why was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi so looking at his son in such a disapproving manner? And my sense from the context of both what you would see, what we're going to take a look at after in a moment, but also just thinking about the relationship mentioned before between Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi with his uncle, is that as opposed to his relationship with his uncle, his son is someone who must show even more deference to his father. And so sometimes the relationship can color the way in which a certain kind of debate, a certain kind of argument can be heard, where on one hand it might seem like, oh, that's a good point. And I don't think that Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's son, was saying anything detrimental about his dad, but that it could be taken that way. And that we should be very mindful of how especially the older generation will take the statements that the younger generation makes. And I know that one thing that I've experienced as a rabbi is not just in terms of my own family set of relationships, however, but that at the same time, also just relating to other rabbis, it's almost as if you have that kind of family relationship, that the way in which we talk about an Av Beit Din, or the leader of a Beit Din, that the language is a father. And it's almost as if we're talking about these kind of hierarchical family-like relationships when it comes to each generation. And then take a look at how this kind of plays itself out. All right. His son said to him, "I did not write it. Rabbi Yehuda Hayada wrote it." So he's saying it's not my fault. Someone else did it. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said to his son, "Turn away from uttering this kind of malicious speech." And I think that's a really powerful idea, kind of separate from the whole family tree thing that I'm focusing on. But the idea that even in a situation where, like, it's true, maybe he wasn't the one involved with it, but that the father is trying to impart a moral value to his son, having to do with what is the right kind of conduct. In this case, when it comes to lashon hara, or malicious speech. So even if you're right, you may still be wrong because the way in which you did this thing leads you to commit some kind of wrong like lashon hara. Another time, Rabbi Shimon was sitting before his father and reciting a section of the book of Psalms. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said to him, "How straight and neat is this writing in this book from which you are reading?" And seemingly it may have been that he wrote it himself, and so his father was giving him a compliment. But what did Rabbi Shimon say? Rabbi Shimon said to him, "I did not write it. Yehuda Hayata wrote it." Now, why would the son want to give credit to somebody else? On one hand, it may just be that this is another example of how Rabbi Shimon is saying it wasn't me, it was him. On the other hand, the idea of having the kind of humility to say, even if like you are the one getting credit for something, that you should not, or that if you get credit for it, to say that somebody else should get credit for it is actually not the right thing to do, because what you're saying is that I'm somebody who does not need to get credit for things. I'm almost like that much greater that, oh, you don't need to compliment me, when really you do like getting complimented by not being so. It kind of reminds me of the joke that a rabbi was given an award for humility and was given a medal for it. And the next day he wore it to shul and the congregation took the medal away, right? You like to kind of have that sense of being humble, but if you actually act on it in a kind of a way, it almost seems as if you're not, because then Rabbi Yehuda Nasi told his son, turn away from uttering this kind of malicious speech, that even that compliment could be considered lashon hara. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring this to you is because here you have an example of deference when it comes to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and his son, especially in regards to, or I should say the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi to his father, and how Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is saying, like, I am the one who's trying to impart value to you. I'm the one who's trying to be able to share with you what it is that is important here. But Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was someone who also did not necessarily do the same thing with the older generation. Like he's saying to his son, you should be deferential. But we saw earlier that he argued with his uncle, Hanina ben Gamliel. And seemingly, he also argued with his dad. Take a look at again. This is again from our learning 169b. The sages taught in a Braita with regard to one who comes to court to be judged over a claim that land that is in his possession belongs to another. If he claims ownership based on a deed, i.e., a bill of sale, and claims further that he is the owner based on presumptive ownership of the land, as it was in his uncontested possession for 3 years, and he therefore does not need the deed as proof, his claim is judged based on the deed. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Okay? So basically, we have two different claims, one on a deed and one on presumptive ownership. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says his claim is judged based on his presumptive ownership. So the father, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, has a different opinion than Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, meaning Rabban Shimon Gamliel has a different point of view. I think it was interesting here, two things. One, in terms of the structure. First, if we are supposed to give deference to the father or to the older generation, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel should have been first because he's older. And then you would have the disagreement from the younger. But also, if we remember the fact that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the editor of the Talmud, was the one who put it all together, okay, right? It's like he's saying, well, I'm going to give my opinion here. But is he also saying that I can be able to have a disagreement with my father? Well, what's interesting about this disagreement is that there's a question that's actually asked here. With regard, the Gemara analyzes the Braita With regard to what do Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel disagree? And then they go into a large conversation about what is a disagreement between the two. And that is to say that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi may not have had a disagreement in person. They may not necessarily have been talking with one another and having this conflict with one another, but rather it's the rabbis of later generations who are saying, oh, are the father and the son actually in agreement or disagreement with one another? Um, One of my favorite rabbinic figures is Rav Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Cook, who was the first chief rabbi of this before the state of Israel was officially created. His son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Cook, is also a very well-known rabbi, especially among many Jews who live in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, depending on how you identify. And I would see that, or I would argue that the elder Rav Kook and the younger Rav Kook are very different from one another. They have very different opinions as to what does it mean to settle the land. There are similarities for sure, but I would be able to say I don't think that they agree here. Would they disagree with each other? Maybe in private, but my guess is that in public they probably would not have done so. Which then leads back to the question of, well, much earlier we read that Rabbi Hanina ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had an argument that seemingly was much more of a one-on-one, given the fact that we don't have the language from the Gemara here, which is like, well, what is a disagreement? It seemed like it was like really back and forth between the two. And maybe it has to do with the fact that, again, you can have disagreements between generations of Tanaim, especially between fourth and fifth generation, third, fourth generation. But there may be something else going on here, which I think is actually really fascinating to think about when it comes to the relationships that we have with folks, especially in our family, and also in the extent to which the relationships change based upon what happens over the course of our life. If you take a look again at the family tree right here, okay? Now, again, Nasi Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's father. Hanina ben Gamliel is the elder son, by the way, of the Nasi. You could also ask the question, well, why wasn't Hanina considered to be, wouldn't he be the one to become the Nasi, become the head of the Sanhedrin, especially if it was an inherited position, given the fact that he was the elder son? I mean, we just had the whole story of Jacob and Esau in terms of the elder son getting the birthright. So why not also here? Well, it may be because it turns out that Hanina ben Gamliel did not live a very long life. Okay? This comes from Bava Kama 83a. The Gemara further pursues this line of inquiry. It has to do with Greek wisdom and learning Greek wisdom. Is Greek wisdom itself actually prohibited? But doesn't Rav Yehuda say that Shmuel says in the name of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who is the right over here, Nasi Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, it is written, my eye affected my soul because of all the daughters of my city. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel applied this verse to a personal tragedy. There were 1,000 children in the household of my father, Rabban Gamliel, i.e., Rabban Gamliel of Yavne. 500 of them studied the Torah, and 500 of them studied Greek wisdom. All of them were killed by the Romans, and the only ones that remain are I, who is here, and the son of my father's brother, who is in Asia Minor. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's statement indicates that it is actually permitted to study Greek wisdom. That's how it was taken. But I want you to hear what's behind this piece. Because, and this occurred during, I'm forgetting which war. I believe it was the first Roman Jewish war during the leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple, or if it was no, actually I'm wrong. It was part of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and during that rebellion, there were many rabbis who were killed. Actually, if you want a great book in terms of thinking about that story surrounding it, take a look at As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg. Really fascinating story that, even though it's not true in terms of the actual history, it's almost an imagined history, imagined midrash based upon teachings we have in the text of what happened to the Jewish community. And it was such a destructive moment within the context of the community itself because so many rabbis were killed, including, or especially based upon this verse, upon this section, Hanina ben Gamliel. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's uncle was killed as part of the purge of rabbis, which means, and given the fact that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was the nephew, my guess is that time-wise, he was probably having the argument in absentia, meaning it wasn't actually arguing directly with Hanina. He was arguing with him after Hanina, unfortunately, was killed by the Romans. So in a certain sense, it reflects a little bit of this notion that yes, there may be disagreements among family members, but at the same time, especially for those when those family members are living, it is important for the generations to be respectful of one another, even in this high profile, especially in this high profile sense of who is leading the Jewish people, who is leading the rabbinic project. And yet, once someone passes away, then it's almost as if you can then begin to have maybe harder conversations. I'll tell you just personally that in my own family, when my grandfather, Zichrono Livracha, passed away, there was a certain sense of like who he was. And then like after he passed away, that's when I got to know a little bit more about some of the decisions he made that, let's just say, maybe not always agree with. And that's okay. Because as the generations move, then you have to be able to deal with your generation at that time. But because we live in a world where, generally speaking, you have three generations, right? A child, a parent, a grandparent, as like a core group that is in existence at the same time, there has to be a recognition of the value of experience, the value of where people have come from. And even though there may be a disagreement and a valid disagreement, we have to always be mindful and always show that sense of respect. And what I loved about this section of Talmud is that we got to get a sense of that, both in how there was respect in when it comes to generations, especially when you're talking about a generation that's living together, like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his son, and also when it comes to thinking about how to have disagreements when you're in the same profession and how to be able to structure those disagreements in a way that still shows the respect that is necessary.
Sorry, looking for my unmute button. Thank you so much, Rabbi Sachs. As always, these texts, all these names swim on the page. And I think to the people who wrote them, these were personalities who loomed large in either their lives or their more recent history. And it is always illuminating to remember that they had all these complicated relationships with each other and that is at play. When we were reading these texts. It's really hard to do from the vantage point of 2,000 years. So thank you for helping us to do some of that today. Thank you to all of you for being here. Let me share one more time. This link, sorry, I didn't label it. This is the sign up for our Siyum. Next Wednesday, we will be celebrating the end of Bava Batra. And the next morning, we will move right on to Sanhedrin. That is what's coming up next. So looking forward to doing all of that with you next week. Thank you again, Rabbi Sachs. Thank you to all of you. And we'll see you soon. Shabbat Shalom.
All right. Take care.